Jim and I will be speaking on this call. Jim is going to do his usual current events, and after that, I'm going to come on and talk about soil microbes. So I'll give a brief introduction, not a brief, but an introduction to what I'll be talking about before I talk about them, not right now. So remember, if you have any questions, I'll probably provide a time about halfway through my talk in which you can ask questions, because we'll be switching gears a little bit. So it'll be a good opportunity, so please keep them in mind. And if you have questions for Jim, hold them to ask until he is finished. And if you need to unmute yourself to ask those questions, it's *6. All right, Jim, thanks for coming on, and go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Zach. My name is Jim Hallbeisen, and usually at the beginning of the conference call, we have a little review of what current events are going on in North American agriculture. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the grower solution that just was mailed out, and a lot of you have received here recently. Probably the biggest event that we're going to be concerned with is the U.S. government report that comes out tomorrow. What we have seen here in the last several weeks has been a little strength in the market. Both corn and beans have had significant strength. Part of the bean strength is China has been constantly buying from the U.S. The South American crop is pretty well exhausted at this point, and so the only game in town is coming out of North America, specifically with the U.S. And China is having some significant problems agriculturally at this point in time, which has really added to the energy market too, or to the corn market. They've had several typhoons that have struck the mainland, and the most recent typhoon has really headed up into the northern part of the country where a lot of corn is grown. And there's been scuttlebutt about problems with a large dam that protects river bottom land up in that area, and that's been a big concern with them. And as far as having any damage from that's not going to get a lot of public play, but they haven't been able to conceal the movement of these typhoons, particularly the last one, and that's put a lot of starch in the market. Part of that goes all the way back to the 10th of August when the derecho went through Iowa, the high winds that caused a significant amount of damage. There's still quite a bit of scuttlebutt about the total acreage that was affected, by that particular windstorm that did go through. That's one thing we will cover a little bit tonight. We get toward the bottom of the half hour. David Armstrong, who farms in Iowa, is going to come on and give you guys kind of a firsthand account of that. I've had several guys that have asked me during our conversations, they didn't understand what that terminology was, and Dave's a lot better at it than I am because they're being bombarded with it consistently out there. And so Dave will be able to give you guys kind of a firsthand account. He's got some damage from it also. After the storm, some of this stuff was blown flat. Some of it was kinked to a certain degree. And like Dave said, it appeared that some of it was coming back a little bit, but then they ran into severe heat here in the last 14 days, up in that 95-degree range. And Dave said at that point, evidently there was enough of a kink in the stem that the plant wasn't able to keep up with the evapotranspiration demand within the plant. And he said there's a lot of areas out there, it looks like the middle of harvest season right now. So Dave will discuss that a little bit, and I think you guys will appreciate getting the firsthand information. The damage is just devastating, and how these guys are going to deal with it. And see, that's helped with this corn market situation. Now, the government has tried to, keep the lid on it a little bit because they don't want any panic buying to let this price get out of control. But in our area, we've seen a fairly significant increase in price. We were down in that $3.30 range or below, and we're pushing up into the 380 range at this point, which when you go to the East Coast, you get our guys they're working with that Eastern market, you can tack on another 30 cents. So I imagine there's some areas in the East that $4 is back in play again with the corn market. And so what we've also seen has been a lot of our guys in the Midwest have flirted with the drought. We've been placed in the moderate drought right here in Northwest Ohio from basically the Indiana border to Cleveland. There's a thin stretch in there that is in areas that are 6 to 8 inches below normal in precipitation. And that's affected our farm. But we've been very happy. We did some walking of fields here for a video here recently, and we're weathering the storm very well. We think, again, the program is helping us significantly with that. And again, we'll know better as we start running the combines, but it's looking like we were able to withstand it pretty good. So again, that's another thing. You get into west central Iowa, they're in severe drought in some areas out there, and that's also added to the market. So what we saw in August when the government came out, which was right after this windstorm went through, they pretty well ignored the windstorm, and that is probably going to be the highest predicted yield for both corn and beans for the season. And they're expecting that to be reduced here as we go along with each report as we get a little bit closer to the final harvest numbers. So again, we may have seen the low in the market. You're going to have seasonal lows here with the harvest getting started. But the effect of the volume is going to be tamped down a little bit because of these different problems. And like I said, a lot of guys in the Midwest have dealt with this dryness issue. Some guys have started to get or have been getting decent rains. Other guys are still struggling with that a little bit, which is why the government is going to have to back off on these volumes a little bit, and that's going to keep a little bit of a floor under the market. So we'll see how much they want to adjust this tomorrow. The other factor is the usage of gas is down. It's still like 7% below usage rate that we had before the COVID crisis got going. So that affects the use of ethanol also. And then there's been a battle with the U.S. government on allowing some of these smaller refiners to skip the ethanol addition. And the politicians had promised agriculture they would help with that. And so now we're going to see if they're going to keep their word on that and force the proper blending of ethanol in the fuel supply. And the EPA is coming out with a decision on that here in the near future. So the report tomorrow is probably going to be the biggest factor of what we're going to see in prices here as we go into the fall market. A couple other things that have gone through U.S. EPA and then the USDA have set out a joint statement where they're actually trying to foster a contest for fertilizer producers to come up with new technologies in fertilization. This sustainability thing that is being talked about in agriculture, particularly from the marketing standpoint, the big food companies are getting blowback from their consumers about, how is your stuff raised? Is it addressing climate change? Is it addressing the issue of the people that are sympathetic to the animals? And see, what they are basically saying, EPA is saying, we want to see some technologies in fertilization that basically will maintain yields but have a much better effect on the environment. And they're offering a competition where people can lay out their technology and show that this can actually happen. And it's kind of interesting when you read some of these things. They're calling it the Enhanced Efficiency Fertilizer Challenge, Environmental and Agronomic Challenge. And they're saying that they want to meet or exceed certain environmental and ag economic criteria. And these new formulations will control fertilizer release or alter reactions that reduce nutrient loss into the environment. And the challenge is basically to maintain or improve yields with less loss. And see, this is basically all going back to the water problems that we have. Here in the Lake Erie Basin, we've seen a smaller bloom this year, but it's pretty simple. We just haven't had the rain to flush the nutrients into the lake. And see, they realize that we get back to normal precipitation, this winter and into next spring, that they're going to have a whale of an influx of phosphorus, into the lake along with nitrogen. So again, this is it's going to create a problem. And see, all the implementations that they have advocated from nutrient management, they're just not working. It's pretty simple. So again, this kind of tells us that this environmental thing is still on the front burner. And see, the thing that I believe we're seeing is, if you look at this dicamba issue with these dicamba beans, basically it got they were basically allowed to use it according to EPA regulations, which is basically controlled by, the branch of government that is controlled by the politicians. And what they basically have had is that suits have been brought against, EPA for not protecting, the citizenry of the country. So you've got the judicial branch that's got into the act. And so they are challenging the executive branch to who's going to control this thing. And see, when the Ninth Circuit basically got involved and shut dicamba off with no more sales, and then the final spraying was going to be the end of July, they re-ruled on that. Bayer went in and asked for another ruling on it, and they ruled against it again. So their only option now is go to the Supreme Court with it. And see, again, that type of thing, in my opinion, with these losses of nutrients, that could come to bear in the fertilizer arena too. EPA is not enforcing some of these laws or nutrient management plans to try to control these nutrient inputs. And so what some of these citizens are doing is turning to the judicial branch. And so again, if that type of lawsuit starts to come into effect and the judges rule, with the citizenry, we could see the same thing, that nitrogen and phosphorus particularly are going to be, on the hot seat with that. And see, we're already seeing in some areas of the country where these co-ops, fertilizer suppliers, are increasing their potassium recommendations because they know they're going to have to cut back on nitrogen and phosphorus. So they got to keep the same kind of cash flow, so they're increasing these potassium recommendations because nobody is paying any attention to excessive potassium application, whether it be, going into the water systems, which they claim it doesn't happen, but nobody's looking for it. And then basically in the food supply, we know that the potassium levels are going up. You guys in the livestock industry, particularly the ruminant business, know that the potash levels in these forages have increased quite significantly. And so that is basically the fertilizer company's game plan, along with things like sulfur, boron, other micronutrients. They know nitrogen and potassium are going to be under the gun, so they're trying to figure out how to sell some of these other products. And they're using all types of strategies on that. So again, I think the whole industry realizes that there's going to be some issues there to be dealt with. One thing I would like to point out to everybody that has looked at the most recent solution is the article on the substantiation for calcium. And we've discussed this for several calls, basically. We picked up an article last spring that was published in Acres USA, which is a summary of an article published in Biodynamics. And it was published by a gentleman that runs a soil testing laboratory in Maine. Now, the difference with this laboratory is he's been basically trying to look at biological measurements of the soil to make some decisions on, fertilizer inputs. And what he is saying with this pH measurement, which has become a standard for the application of limestone, which again we look at as the application of calcium being your guideline. And his statement is that really the pH test for the soil media doesn't have much validity because the test was basically designed to be used with liquid systems, particularly blood. See, a lot of agronomists and that say that the pH test is very, very necessary, and blood testing of pH is a very good example of that, which is true. But the fact of the matter is the blood is already a liquid system. And see, when you bring in soil, you'll have to artificially liquefy that system. And this gentleman is saying that that artificial liquefying of the soil itself creates significant problems for the pH. It's not a consistent system. It's really an artificial system. And his whole contention is that the pH has very little meaning as a standalone test. And see, it's being used that way because of its simplicity. And see, Victor Tejan saw this, all the way back into the 1930s. Basically, the pH test came into existence at that point, and as fertilization started to become more of an issue, and they were using various testing methods to find the elements in there, pH was very, very simple to run. Then we can make some decisions with that and add that to the complexity of the soil test to make it look, more realistic or more useful. And this gentleman totally undermines that. And the idea that overliming injury gives you excessive pH. He said in Europe they've realized for many years that the actual liquefaction of the soil artificially inflates the alkaline nature of the soil. In other words, the pH is artificially increased as you put that water in there, and that the actual pH, if it does exist, is going to be significantly lower in that. And see, many of the soil testing labs have implemented the SMP buffer or the Shoemaker, McLean, and Pratt buffer to try to overcome that problem of the liquefaction of the soil. But again, it's ease of operation, and it's not very hard to teach a work-study student how to run a pH meter. And see, that validity as far as deciding how much limestone you need on the soil, we feel, or much calcium as you need on the soil, is not very helpful. So again, this test pretty well gives us third-party verification on that. And for those of you that are interested in it, you can contact Carla. She's got it figured out now what most guys are looking for in the pH test, and you can get that biodynamic article. And he refers directly to the pH chart that a lot of people use, showing that with overliming injury, you're tying up all the trace elements because the pH gets too high. Then that will give you trace element tie-up. But he's saying the validity of that chart is, and we've known that in the past, that the literature review on that's been very poor. We don't even really know where that comes from. But again, the validity of the tests making that usable, he said, is not realistic. And so again, that kind of shows what we've been seeing as a company, that pH, just because the pH is higher, they're saying you got plenty of calcium, and we come in with a fine high calcium limestone, apply it, and we start to see changes in the soil. And see, part of that is from affecting the biological life. See, the premises of it is to open the soil up through flocculation and get more air in there. And as soon as you do that, you start to enliven the biological activity and makes up many of the nutrients in the soil more available, allows the roots to probe deeper so you have more access to nutrients. So again, what the calcium does in the soil, we think is really a strong foundation to get this idea of cutting back on your total input package. And see, the biggest argument against it, well, of course, is the high pH, but the cost factor. And see, we're saying that that's something that you have to discover, through strip testing. And then once you figure out what you need to get the soil to react differently, that's your goal is financially. What can you afford? We realize you're not going to fix that overnight because nobody's been addressing it. But once you know what you need to get on, you can get that on the acres that you can afford and land you control. Even in the rented situation, guys that control the land over a period of several years feel that if they can get find enough material on and get it reacting, that they can get the utilization of that in a short period of time. And what happens many times is you improve the soil. Now the people that own it, they're looking for more rent. So again, that's why you get into that situation that you got to start working on what you own and try to get that fixed and see how quick you can really get that to change for you and if you can economically recover that. So again, this idea of overliming injury, driving the pH too high, this publication basically refutes that. And so again, we think that kind of backs our position and what Victor Tejas has been talking about from the beginning. Yeah, we've got to be looking, if you're going to use the soil test to any degree, we think you got to be looking at the CEC and the exchangeability and the work that was done by the soil chemists in the early 20s, showing that as you dominate that CEC with calcium, you start to change the soil physically and open it up. And then once that happens, water percolation, and really Victor Tejas, who came along, toward the end of the Industrial Revolution, could see that farmers were using tillage as a way to oxidize soil. And see, his whole premise was that this calcium will help you with that. You get that on the number of times or the depth of tillage, you can back off on that a little bit and use some of that revenue to get the calcium on. So now you got to discover where the level is that gives you what you're looking for. But again, that oxidation factor is very, very critical because roots have got to breathe. You got to get penetration to get depth of rooting, and then the biological has to breathe. The biological we're looking for, what the symbiotic biology you're looking for to grow the crop, exists best in that aerobic environment. So that helps the overall premise of your soil. So is Dave Armstrong, are you on yet, Dave?
Yeah, I am, Jim. I'm here.
Yeah. I'm going to turn this over to Dave. Dave is our DM in Iowa. He works in Wisconsin. He works in Missouri also. But several of the guys that I've been talking with in the last week since the windstorm on the 10th of August, they don't really know a whole lot about it, and they're real reluctant to gobble everything down that the public press is talking about. So I thought we'd give them a firsthand account of what's going on, and Dave's been affected by it too, so he can talk pretty intelligently about the whole situation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave.
You give me more credit than due if you tell them I'm going to talk intelligently. So
that's the goal.
All right, we'll try to see if we can make the mark. I'll tell you what, you guys that put up with hurricanes on a regular basis, I tell you what, I got my eyes open. I was leaving to go have a field day in the Pilot Grove, Missouri area, which is just south of I-70 and more towards the western side of the state, not completely westerly, but more westerly. And I left home and had paid no attention, and you know how it is when you're going to run off a couple of days. You do 3 days worth of chores in one day and hope the chore boy don't get overwhelmed on you. And I left home and actually I got a couple miles up the road, and I just had never seen a sky that looked quite as ominous as that. And we've been in a drought here too. We had a drought breaker this week. We've probably received about 4 inches of rain and come just right, just all day, real light rain all day long. So praise the Lord for that. We really needed it. We're getting pretty short on pasture. But I'll tell you, that wind hit, and it was the most amazing thing. And by the time I got to the town that I first would go through to fill my pickup up with gasoline, if any of you ever seen the movie Twister, when they're driving down the road and they're dodging all kinds of combines and trees and cows and such like, it was a little bit like that. The trees was just coming down all over the place, and I had no idea what it was. And, you know, we had no weather information, no warning ahead of time that is what we were about ready to face. And I said in the town of Montezuma, I finally figured out after a trash dumpster rolled in the road in front of me and still debris just falling all over the place. I thought, man, I need to get somewhere, and I realized the wind was heavy out of the west, so I got on the east side of a building and pulled up real close for protection. And I sat there for 20 minutes, and because I happened to look at the time, I was starting to run a little bit late, and I had another guy I was going to meet, and I wanted to make sure we had the time frame right. So I sat there for about 20 minutes, and gosh, I returned back home after that just to see what had happened, because my wife called me and she said, you better come back home if you haven't got too far. And I wasn't torn up as bad as some, and I'll get into that a little bit, but I had some damage, and we actually had a situation where, you know, gosh, we're out of electricity for a few minutes. We think we're devastated, but down to Cedar Rapids after that event, I believe there's areas there that probably didn't have electrical service for maybe 5 to 7 days. But so I continued south and did the field day, and when I returned back home, I decided to go start looking around. When I got down there, the fellows, the farmers, was telling me what a storm it really was, and they're showing some pictures on the internet. And so I drove probably 30 miles north of me on my return home to see what it really looked like in actuality. And like I said, you guys in the hurricane belt, maybe you've seen this before, but I never have. I mean, it is literally field back to back of corn blown flat to the ground, broke off flat to the ground. It just, words can't describe it. I summons Jim Allbison to jump in his car and come and look at it, because it's such a devastation. But grain bins, empty grain bins laying everywhere. We observed a bin that probably had went a mile and a half down the road, probably a 40-foot bin, and it was wrinkled up and laying there in the grader ditch, and the roof was in one place and the bin was in another place. And it just is that stuff that everywhere. Trees broke off everywhere. Farmsteads that had probably had 3 generations of work, where, you know, Grandpa built a barn, and then the son come along and built a cattle building, and now the son that's there's put up some more cattle structures, or maybe built some grain facilities, grain legs, whatever it might be. Everything was just bent over and broke off. Harvester silos looked like somebody and this is, to me, is amazing, and you guys have been around harvester silos. It just looked like somebody took them like a soft pop can and just gripped them with their fist and just smashed them flat, and still standing and looking like that. It's such an amazing sight to see. And when they say that it didn't do a lot of damage and there's not a lot of crop loss, they're starting to zero guys out now. A couple of the insurance, well, they got together quickly after this happened to make, with the federal people came and started looking this over, and they started to make some assessments, and they've decided to go ahead and let guys zero this stuff out and offer them, I'm hearing $750 an acre. Don't quote me on that. It's just a numbers being passed around, but they roll it down with a big roller, and then they go 2 different directions with a vertical tillage tool. And the hope is to get it to grow so they can work it back in again, get the corn to grow. Soybeans didn't get hurt that much, and hay didn't seem to be either, because amazingly enough, with in our area, 20 minutes of this 60, the anemometer for our area said it blew 60 to 80 miles an hour, and then 100-mile-an-hour gusts. And in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, it blew, I believe they said it was 80 to 100 miles an hour and 140 mile an hour gusts. But the anemometers there were not set to take that much, so they brought some professionals in to analyze this, and I don't know, whatever force hurricane that was, I think they said maybe 3 or 4. It's just, you just can't imagine the devastation when the wind blows like that for 45 minutes. Like I said, you Southern people, I'm my hats off to you. If you put up with that on a yearly basis, I just couldn't imagine doing it. It's been hard on us up here. You know, our crops all blown down. Some mine isn't as bad as others. I'm thankful for that. But I got a neighbor, and hopefully Jim will get pictures of somehow. We talked about it earlier today, but I got a neighbor, and he's got a field right directly east of me, and my corn took some damage, but his is completely flat, and he's asking to be zeroed out. And at this point, they're not allowing him to do it. They told him he's going to harvest what he can and harvest it with a head probably 2 feet high and document that and run over the rest, and then they'll figure out how crop insurance is going to remunerate him for what he did get. But it's just all over the place. And it's just crazy. You got all kinds of guys in here trying to make deals with the insurance company early so they can bring in some corn chopping equipment and put up bunkers or put up piles, and it's not going well. And on top of it all, we got a drought here in my locale. We probably went 10 weeks without any significant amount of rain, and you know, like I said earlier, that DeRoche didn't bring rain either. A couple tenths was in the gauge at most places, and so the corn last week with 95-degree days every day long and still maintained about a 75-degree night, the corn just turned brown instantly. So we're in a little bit of a pickle here, but we're resilient. You know, God's been good to us, and we'll survive this. But it's tough. The attitudes of guys is down. You know, it's like I told Jim earlier today. It's like when your mom found out you did something wrong and she hollers out the door and summons you to the house to tell you to lay over the chair. You're going to get a whipping. That's just kind of the way guys feel around here, because they just aren't too enthusiastic to go out and start into this mess. But we know we've got to. So. But it's huge. It just, you can drive for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles up and down country roads, and it's the same situation everywhere. Corn is just broke off flat. So.
Appreciate that, Dave.
Any questions? I'd sure answer some, but yeah, that's the short version of the long story, put it that way. So,
thanks, Dave. If you guys do have questions for Jim or Dave, it's *6 to unmute yourself and then ask. All right. Thanks a lot, Jim and Dave, for coming on. That's a lot of destruction. I'm sorry that happened. We'll move into the portion on soil microbes now, which will be myself. So I should preface this by saying that I'm not an expert on soil microbes by any means. I've done a decent amount of research, but it's information that's easily available to anybody with an internet connection and probably available at a library. So this information's it's easily available. You guys could all learn it if you so desired to. And if it really piques your interest, I would encourage it, because the soil microbe environment and population has such a huge impact on everything that grows. So I'm going to start out by explaining what soil microbes are, giving an overview of what they are specifically, the kind of environment they like, the kind of the ins and outs of how they grow, stuff like that. I'm going to go into a couple of points that I like to reiterate quite a bit that I think are really important to understand as a farmer when dealing with microbes, and then I'll go into describing bacteria and fungi in a little more detail than I have before. So for those of you that are able to and have listened to the podcast we've done on this, a lot of this information will be reviewed for you, but I know there's a lot of people potentially listening in who don't have access to those. So I'm going to be going over a lot of that same information. So to begin, what are soil microbes? So what we're talking about, they're microscopic, so they cannot be seen by the naked eye, and they live in, on, and around soil particles. So for the most part, they're the most prevalent in the first few inches of soil, because that's where the most organic matter is. But you can find them at all layers of soil, and you can find them in all soils around the world. It could be a swampiest muck or the driest desert, and you will find microbes there. So there's a few different kinds, and there's more being found every year. This is very much an emerging field. So even 10 years ago, the assumption was that there were fewer microbes than there actually are in the soil. So we're just finding out more and more and more how prevalent and how important these things are. So there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's protozoa, nematodes. Those are the four main categories of the microbes, and then you're going to get your macroinvertebrates. Those are bigger ones, macro versus micro, so like earthworms and beetles and stuff like that. We're not going to be talking about those at all. So microbes are not uniform in the soil. They're obviously very small, so the populations vary a lot. And so when I say population, I should probably define that. I'm talking about a unique group of diverse microbes that are limited to a certain area. So most of the time that area is going to be relatively small. Since these things are so small and they're not very mobile, the populations change a lot over short distances. So this isn't like like the boreal forest, where you have this massive forest expanse that covers pretty much the entire northern portion of the world, of Canada and Russia, and you can find similar species across the entire thing. That's not what this is. Soil microbes are very diverse. As I said before, there are so many of them. There's so many different species even that we don't even know about. And so if you take 1 square foot of soil in a field or in a forest, and then you take the one next to it, you can get very different populations. Now they're going to serve some of the same functions, but the populations themselves will be different. And that's because they're influenced by a lot of different things. So climate obviously has an influence. You're going to find different microbes in the tropics than you are in the north. You're going to find different microbes on a coast than you are in the Midwest. The environment type they're in, so again, that has to do with climate, but you're looking at soil type, vegetation type, stuff like that. Oxygen availability is a huge influence. And then human factors, that's how we manage the land and stuff like that, obviously has an impact on them. The two factors that have the most impact, though, which kind of surprised me, is actually vegetation type and oxygen availability. I found quite a number of papers that said that even you can have, hang on a second, they said that oxygen availability has even more of an impact on the types of populations of microbes you will have, and that's oxygen availability in the soil, of course, than the climate they're in. So if you have soils that have similar oxygen availability, you're more likely to have similar populations than you would in areas that have similar climates. Very surprising to me, because I would have imagined, like a lot of species, that climate would have a huge impact on where they prefer to live. The other really, really important factor is vegetation type. And this one was a little less surprising, but it's quite interesting, because the way it works is that soil microbes, and we'll get into this symbiosis later, a lot of them live in a relationship with a plant. And so they're mutually benefiting each other. That's what symbiosis is. And so microbes will colonize an area, and they will have a preferred plant type. And so they will make the soil hospitable to that plant type, and that plant will presumably grow, colonize the area as well. And it will create a soil condition that favors the type of soil microbes that it prefers. And so you're going to get this give and take where plants colonize or soil microbes colonize, create favorable conditions for other species to colonize, and then perhaps there's a fire or something like that, where the land is cleared, new species come in and colonize, they create conditions that prefer different, that are hospitable to different species, and the cycle continues. So my point being that the relationship between microbe and plant is very, very important for having healthy and diverse populations. I'll stop there for a brief period of question asking. That's kind of my introduction. If there's anything I've missed, guys, don't be afraid to point it out if you have questions. So remember *6.
Hey, Zach, I'd like to comment.
Sure, go ahead, Jim.
You know, Zach, you know, what he's been researching, this oxygen idea, guys, I mean, that shouldn't be revolutionary to you guys. I mean, you go back to your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers, you know, tillage was the name of the game. And see, that's some of the, you know, John Deere itself is huge because of the Industrial Revolution getting involved with tillage. And that's just strictly an oxygen factor. Okay, you get some weed control out of that too, but once you get that oxygen in there, you start to create the environment that gives you the microbes that give you the best symbiosis with the plant. And see, that was the whole predicate from Victor Tegens, is if we can affect that oxygen level in that soil with the addition of the calcium, you know, and the calcium doing other things for us, feeding the plant, feeding the microbes, plus we need that element in our tissue that we're going to eat. But we're getting all those benefits, plus we're oxidizing that environment, and that's the critical factor. And see, that's exactly what Zach's finding out, is that aeration, like he said, it was even more important than the type of vegetation is in there. And see, that goes to rotation. You know, we know rotation is very critical to when we're focused on, you know, you come back in back of an alfalfa crop with corn, you got to be a total idiot not to get a good corn crop. And see, that's that factor there. But he's saying that air factor is even more critical. And see, the alfalfa is doing a couple things for the corn crop, giving it the proper vegetation, but also aerating with its massive root structure. We just can't emphasize enough how important that oxygen thing is. And that's, you know, a lot of guys, when we talk so much about calcium, they misconstrue that it's a direct need for calcium. There is a big need for calcium, but the air is the number one thing, because, again, that's what you guys are raising, sugar, you know, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That oxygen factor is absolutely paramount.
Yep. Thanks, Jim. Absolutely right. In the absence of air, and we'll get a bit more into this later, you do have microbial populations that are anaerobic, meaning they don't require oxygen. They're very different than aerobic, and one of the biggest jobs that especially bacteria and fungi do is decomposition. Aerobic decomposition is far faster than anaerobic decomposition. If you guys have ever been to a bog where it's constantly saturated with water, we've all heard the stories of bog bodies, right? People that died or were buried in a bog, and their bodies are dug up hundreds of years later, and they're quite preserved. They have barely decomposed. That's anaerobic decomposition. It is very slow. So that's a morbid example of it, but a good one. And so that's why another reason that oxygen is so important to get in there, because then you're going to get healthy decomposition and faster decomposition. And the faster your decomposition is, the faster you're cycling nutrients in the system. So they're being made available, used, plant dies, decomposed, made available, used. Anyway, thanks, Jim. That was a good point to make. So moving on, there are two other points that I always find really important to make, and I'll explain why after I make them. So the first one is that these populations need to be stable but not static. So what that means, stable means that they exist without any immediate threat to their existence. So a stable population, using a simpler example, a stable population of a wolf pack, let's say, would mean that the wolf pack is not in immediate danger of being killed, whether that be from hunters or natural disaster, outcompeted by a different species, something like that. The wolf pack is stable, disease even, it's reproducing, so it's guaranteeing that there's going to be this wolf pack in the future. That's a stable population. Static is not the same. Static means that something remains the same. So even in that wolf pack example, in terms of them guaranteeing their future by having offspring, the wolf pack's not always going to be the same. It's not always going to be made up of the same individuals. It's going to be made up of their pups that then grow up and have pups of their own. In the soil, that's the same way. These things reproduce and die on a very fast basis. So these populations are constantly moving forward and changing. The population should not be the same always. You're going to get new species that come in and outcompete another one naturally. That's normal. That's okay. That's how the system functions. That moves me into point number 2, which is that it needs to be diverse and resilient. Like any good food web, you do not want to dominate any population with one species or with a select handful of species. You want that what resilient means is that it can easily bounce back from minor disturbances. So you think about a forest ecosystem. A tree falls in the forest. Well, that's a minor disturbance. It happens all the time. It's a normal part of a tree life cycle. It grows, it lives, it dies. Eventually it falls down. A killer windstorm comes through, like Dave was explaining, and knocks it down. Well, that's a minor disturbance. You have the death of the tree. Maybe it took out a few more trees or smaller plants on its way down. You have the canopy opened up. You have sunlight coming in. That's a minor disturbance. If the forest was not resilient, it could not bounce back from that, and a tree coming down would destroy the forest. However, that's obviously not the case. If there's resilience there, it's able to bounce back. Even a forest fire, a resilient ecosystem, actually a lot of them need forest fires, but the fire burns, kills off older individuals, it opens up seed bed, hugely opens up the canopy. A resilient ecosystem will bounce back and grow something. Same way in the soil, you're going to have minor disturbances all the time. I mean, especially in a farm field, if you're using toxic fertilizer, you have that. Even tillage to a degree, you have a really heavy rainstorm, it drowns it out, something like that. If you don't have that diversity of the population, where you have all kinds of different species interacting with each other and filling niches, then you really risk the chance of losing the function of the system. And I'll explain those functions a little bit later. I hope I've made that clear. Again, when the question time comes, if that's not clear, guys, please ask, tell me, and I'll try to clarify it more. The reason that I bring up those 2 points is that I've noticed in agriculture that soil microbes have been treated like a commodity. Everybody has probably heard of what we call the bug in a jug, where somebody's trying to sell you this bacteria because it's going to form nodes on your soybeans and you're going to get nitrogen fixing capabilities, or this one in corn because it's going to provide phosphorus early in the season. All you have to do is inoculate your seed with it or put it on the seed when you plant, and you're good to go. For the record, and this is my opinion, based on the research I've done, I think that all of those are not worth your money. You may get success occasionally, but more often than not, you're not going to. And here's why. Based on those 2 points I made, introducing a foreign species, which is what you're doing with bug in a jug, into the system is needlessly tampering with it, and more than likely you're not going to get any good result. So there's a few things that could happen. You introduce, I'll give an easy example to understand it in a second, but you introduce a new species into the system. Chances are that species is not adapted to thrive or survive in that system, so it's going to get introduced in there, it's going to get immediately outcompeted by the native species, it's going to die, and you wasted your money. Alternatively, it might get in there, and it might do the outcompeting. So now you have introduced a new element into a system that was already stable, and it is now competing within that system. If the system is resilient, meaning you have a healthy soil that is able to support a diverse population of microbes, chances are you haven't done a ton of damage. But that microbe is just going to become another one of millions, and again, you probably wasted your money. If you apply enough that it outcompetes on a wide scale, then you've upset the balance of that system. It's probably no longer resilient, and you're going to have a big problem on your hands. In the cases where it works, chances are it's going to work for a season, and then next season it won't because the population has changed and it's going to get outcompeted, and that could even be true across different feet within the field. So you might get some success in a 10-foot 10 square foot area because the populations in that area respond well to it. In the area right next to it, nothing happens because the populations there are different. They outcompeted it. It died. Didn't do any good. So my point is, we shouldn't be trying to add in microbes into the soil, like I'll say man-made, but they're not made by man. They're just cultured by man and sold in a jug. Because we don't know what's actually in there. We don't have that much control over it. We actually have very little control over what goes on down there. A better option is to take the populations that are naturally in that soil, give them the best possible chance of survival and thriving. There's two ways that we do that. One is to remove disturbances, man-made disturbances, obviously. So we should not be applying toxins to the soil, and we should be aerating that soil. Again, emphasis on that. They are aerobic. We need to, that soil needs to be open and breathing. And so I'll go into explaining a little two biggest types of microbes now. So the first is bacteria. Bacteria are by far the most numerous in the soil. They're small single-celled organisms. There's millions, probably billions of individual species of bacteria in the soil. So broadly, they can be categorized into 4 groups. I'm going to focus most on 2 of them. So the first is decomposers that I mentioned before. The second is mutualists. That's the ones that live in symbiotic relationship with the plants. The third is pathogenic, and the fourth is chemoautotroph. So very briefly, pathogenic is pretty clear. They're the ones that cause disease, stuff like that in crops. They have a parasitic relationship with the plant, so they benefit by harming the plant. Chemoautotrophs are actually aerobic and anaerobic, and they're the ones that can break down heavy metals and toxins, stuff like that. The 2 bigger groups, so decomposers are the most abundant, and I would argue the most broadly important. They break down organic matter. This is vital because that is what keeps nutrient cycles going. If you guys could imagine that you lived in somewhere without these bacteria, and you take the grain off the corn, shred it up, and put the trash down in the field, well, for the next 10 years, that trash is going to stay right there, and it is not going to change because it's not being decomposed. So all of those nutrients, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and you name it, all the other microbes, is going to stay locked up in that, unavailable. So by decomposing that material, it's releasing those nutrients to then be available again in the nutrient cycle to be able to grow a plant. Extremely vital to life on Earth. Extremely vital to an agricultural field too, obviously. So these guys keep the nutrient cycles going. Bacteria prefer easily broken down material because they are immobile. They can't go anywhere, and they cannot produce enzymes like fungus can, and I'll get into that soon. So they prefer easily broken down material, and therefore they love the rhizosphere of the plant, and that's the area. The rhizosphere is a very small area around the roots, and that's when the plant releases root exudate, which is starch, sugar. It releases out into that zone for the sole purpose of feeding those microbes because it lives in a symbiotic relationship with them. So they get this easy to digest energy source, and in return they are breaking down other materials, and then when they die, they become sort of a biological manure for the plant. And so the other group of bacteria are called the mutualists, and they are the ones that form very specific symbiotic bonds with the plant. So the decomposers live in a symbiotic relationship in the sense that they decompose material and then provide the nutrients to the plant. In return, they get starch. The mutualists actually, like the best example are the bacteria that create nodes in legumes, like soybeans or alfalfa. And they actually have the ability to harvest nitrogen out of the air and convert it into a plant available form. So the plant roots will allow it to infect them, and I use the word infect in quotes because it's not a bad infection. And those are the nodes they create so that they're inside their root, harvesting oxygen. Oh, look, you need to have oxygen in the soil for that to happen. Oxygen, you need to have air, which is mostly nitrogenous gas. And then they make that nitrogen available to the plant. That's how that relationship works. Legumes cannot produce that nitrogen on their own. They simply form a relationship with these bacteria that are able to do it. So if you dig up a soybean plant in a field with really poor soil, you're not going to find as many nodes as you will in a field with healthy soil that's aerated and not full of toxins, because those bacteria are better able to survive. So moving into fungi, I find fungi very interesting. You can actually see them. Now, fungi themselves are individual cells, like bacteria, not visible to the naked eye, but they form hyphae, which are strands that gather together into mycelium. And those are, if you guys dig up a shovel full of soil and you see a bunch of white strands in it, that's actually soil fungi, and that's very good to see. So the reason that fungi does that is because it enables them to cover a much wider area in search of organic matter. So fungi primarily are decomposers as well. They do roughly the same job as bacteria, but they can actually attack tougher to break down carbon structures, which all organic matter is carbon, such as like a tree. A tree has lignin, very stable, very strong carbon structure. Bacteria can't touch it, partially because they can't get to it. They're not mobile, but they also don't create the enzymes to break it down. Fungi, through the hyphae and the mycelium they create, can actually sneak, so to speak, into small holes in the lignin and release enzymes to break it down. So fungi are naturally much more populous in a forest ecosystem where there's a lot of hard to break down carbon structures, but they're also present in an agricultural field. You very much want fungus, soil fungus in your fields. It also forms the same kind of mutualistic bonds with plants, both decomposers and the specific mutualists. The decomposers, I would argue, do a better job because by having these networks of mycelium, they can actually search out and bring back nutrients that are not just in the immediate area of the plant roots. And then the mutualists roughly do the same thing as bacteria. They have all kinds of jobs. One I would like to highlight is actually alerting the plant when there is a potentially pathogenic organism entering the area. The fungi doesn't want the plant to get infected any more than the plant does, because that's its what's the term? That's its golden goose. There we go. That's where it's getting its sustenance. It likes the starch stuff that the root actually did as well. So when a new fungi or other organism enters the area of the plant roots, the fungi will actually alert the plant so it can activate its defenses before it gets infected. So to bring this back around to a grower's perspective, like I said before, we're not trying to specifically control the types of species that are in the soil. We can't do that. You can't guarantee anything. You can apply all the bug in the jugs that you want, but you're going to be spending a lot of money for results that most often you're not even going to be able to see. Chances are it's not going to even work, and if it does, it might be such a minor benefit that it wasn't worth it. So your better option is to simply provide a growing medium, that is the soil, that is aerated via calcium additions. It's the best way to aerate the soil without tilling it up every year, and not filling it with toxins. Those are the two best ways that we as humans can influence the populations in the soil. And so that would obviously be GMS, created or manufactured with very low toxins and calcium on the soil to aerate it. And honestly, let the populations in your soil do the work for you. The better conditions you provide for them, and then just kind of take your hands off and let them do the work, that's the way that the Lord intended it, and that's the way that He created it. We don't need to get fancy here. Provide the oxygen, don't harm them, and they will form those relationships with the plants. They will form diverse and healthy populations in the soil, and they will be adapted to the conditions that are present in that area. So that's all I have now, unless you guys have any questions. We're at 10 o'clock now, but I think we can go a few minutes over. So remember, *6 to unmute yourself if you have any questions. All right. I would like to continue with this at a future date. It won't be next month. So the next conference call is October 8th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And every October, the owners will come on from the company, and Matt Schroeder as well, I'd imagine, to talk about pricing for the next year and amongst other things. But I would like to pick up this discussion once I've done more research in the future. So that will obviously, that information will be in a sales letter. Thanks, Jim and Dave Armstrong, again for coming on. And thank you guys for listening in. I hope it's been informative. Have a good night, everyone. Goodbye.